Oh, thank you, Adrian. So I'll just start by, tacking on to Adrian's acknowledgement of traditional owners. I'm also on Wurundjeri land today. And I guess, being a grassland ecologist, part of my acknowledgement is acknowledging the enormous contribution that the Wurundjeri people have made to the flora and fauna, the biota, the ecosystem that I'm passionately concerned about. I'm not Indigenous, but I'm a fifth generation Australian. I work out at the St Albans campus of Victoria Uni, and I live less than 5 kilometres from that campus, and have lived in Melbourne on the Basalt Plains all the entirety of my life. So I'm not Indigenous, but I feel like I've got a pretty strong connection to the place where I live, work, and I'm very concerned about. So this is a presentation that I gave to the Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association back in 2017, and I haven't really added to it. I've more subtracted from it. So it's not, it doesn't cover everything up to the minute, but it does give an overview of striped legless lizards, and there's a question mark at the end of a short history, and that will become apparent. So let's see if I can progress through these slides without causing a disaster. No, I can't. Oh, okay, here we go. Right, who can make sense of that? I don't know. Okay, so I guess the first question that I'm often asked, when I tell people that I work on striped legless lizards is, well, isn't it a snake? And no, it's not a snake. And here are a few tips to help you, just tell the difference between a striped legless lizard and snakes. So what I'm going to do, just remember that I've got this little icon here and I forget to use it. So if I move on to the next slide, tell me off. Just starting at the first picture, the arrow is pointing to the ear hole. So striped legless lizards have ear holes. Not all legless lizards do, but our striped legless lizards do have ear holes. Snakes do not have ear holes. This is not a striped legless lizard, but it is a species of legless lizard, and I'm using this to demonstrate that they actually have rudimentary hind limbs. So all evidence of the forelimbs has been lost through evolution, but they do still have external evidence of hind limbs, which have been reduced to these scaly flaps. And we don't really know what these scaly, they probably don't really have all that much use really, but they're just still there. So my striped legless lizards have very similar looking vestigial limbs to this legless lizard here. Here you can see the tongue, and when I'm talking to school students, it's always like, oh, what shape does a snake, what shaped tongue does a snake have? And so we always get the forked tongue that the students are very familiar with. But striped legless lizards, in fact, all legless lizards have a rounded tongue like this. And you can see there's just a little notch at the base here. So they use their tongue to wipe their eye, which is covered by a clear spectacle. They don't actually have eyelids. This last picture shows a striped legless lizard. There's actually lost part of its tail. So a lot of people are familiar with skinks that drop their tail to escape predators, and striped legless lizards can also do the same thing. So this legless lizard has lost, the tail is broken off here, and you can see there's a tiny little bit of regrowth. This will actually regrow. So it will in the end have a long tail. The other interesting thing about this picture is that you can see this hind limb here, and that hind limb is approximately associated with the vent. So basically the bum of the legless lizard. And so what we know from that is that the body of the lizard runs from the vent all the way up to the snout. And so we call that the snout vent length. And then the rest of the animal is tail. And this tail, if it hadn't broken, would be 2 times the length of this snout vent length. So they have very, very long tails and they can break. So this one's obviously lost quite a lot of tail because that's not even the full amount of the snout vent length. So it should be, you know, that length and this one plus a bit more. If you happen to go to the zoo and you visit the reptile house and look at the snakes, and you start thinking about how much of the snake is its body and how much is its tail, most of the snake that you can see is actually body. And once you start looking at this, you can very easily pick out the point at which the tail begins. And they always have tiny little stumpy tails at the ends of their very long bodies. So striped legless lizards, short bodies, long tails; snakes, long bodies, short tails. And finally, you know, there's a whole range of features, but these are some of the ones I've listed. But finally, they actually squeak. So snakes make a hissing noise. All the school kids know that. Did that sound come through? Did you not hear a lizard squeaking sound?
Sadly not.
Oh, so disappointing. The problems of Zoom. I'm not sure if I can do anything. Maybe at the end of the presentation, we can have another try at that. Could you not even hear it coming just through my microphone? No. Oh, bother. Okay. Anyway, so what I can do is I can sort of replicate that sound because I've had a bit of practice with the school kids now. So the noise they make is a squeaking noise. So it's sort of like, and all the school kids look at me like I'm a complete weirdo. Anyway, forward ho. Striped legless lizards are not snakes. Where did they come from? So they belong to this infraorder called the Geckota. So they're part of really the gecko family, and they have a lot of shared characteristics. So Alan Greer back in 1989 published a book called The Biology and Evolution of Australian Lizards, and he listed a whole lot of shared characteristics between not just striped legless lizards, but other legless lizards and the Australian geckos. So we've got things like their external similarities with external morphology, behavior, skull anatomy, the skeleton behind the skull, soft anatomy, and similarities in reproduction as well. I'm really struggling with moving through the slides. Where did these lizards that have evolved from geckos come from? So they're actually closely related to a group of geckos called the diplodactyloid geckos. And so that's this group in the red circle. And so we've got 3 families that are all considered to be sister clades of each other. And these families are of Gondwanan origin. So the work that's been done suggests that that group of geckos actually arose approximately 70 million years ago. And so this was at a time preceding Australia separating from Antarctica. And at that time, 70 million years ago, this group of geckos was the only group of squamates. So squamates are lizards and snakes. So this was the only group of squamates in Australia. So back 70 million years ago, that's all we had. We didn't have any snakes. And so that was the case at the time of Australia separating from Antarctica. and the circumpolar current causing an onset of aridity. And as the continent dried out, our group of lizards, the Pygopodidae, the flat-footed legless lizards, actually had a diversification. So we see a big increase in the number of species and genera of legless lizards once Australia and Antarctica have separated. Okay. So Paul Oliver and Sanders did a genetic study on the origins of Australian geckos, and in their 2009 publication, they made this really, strong comment that these ancient gecko lineages have persisted through extreme changes in environment and climate and are amongst the oldest radiations of vertebrates restricted to the Australasian region. So really emphasising the, origins, dating back to significant portions of time and how significant these groups of animals are in the Australian biota. So striped legless lizards are in the family Pygopodidae. These are the flat-footed lizards, and there are about 8 genera, so 8 different groups of legless lizards. Accounting for, it depends who's doing the counting, but, probably more than 40 species, and we sort of every now and then get a new one added on. So that's a little bit exciting. The family is endemic to the Australian region, so almost all of those 40 plus species are only found in Australia, and we've got a couple of species that are also found in New Guinea. The group is monophyletic, meaning that it has a common ancestor. We don't have multiple sources of origin for this group. There's just one common ancestor. So they're a truly Australian group of animals. So how do we get, I love this photo. This photo was supplied to me by Steve Wilson, and it's a legless lizard eating a gecko. So they're sort of all part of the same family, but preying on each other. So, we've got geckos, and geckos tend to be pretty conservative. They, usually have all their fingers and toes and just, classically look like geckos. So how do we get from geckos to these things that people think might be snakes? And so Richard Shine did a bit of work on this back in 1986. And I guess part of the change in morphology goes back to that time at which, there weren't any snakes in Australia. We just had these diplodactyloid geckos as, pretty much the only squamate fauna in Australia. And they're very conservative. So fingers, toes, all their body bits, very conservative lifestyles. And what that meant was that there were a whole lot of niches that were actually unfilled at that point in time. And so the thinking is that that meant that there were times of day, because a lot of geckos are nocturnal, times in the 24-hour cycle where, there's an availability of time for other animals to go and fill those niches in the daytime rather than the nighttime. There are probably lots of spaces that those geckos aren't occupying. And so what's thought to have happened is that the body of these animals started to elongate to start to be able to use spider burrows and small cracks and spaces where geckos might not so easily get because of, having their limbs and all that sort of thing. And so this is considered a proto-adaptation to burrowing, and we say that striped legless lizards have a fossorial or semi-fossorial lifestyle where they're living at least part of the time in the soil profile. And we see this in other species of legless lizard as well. So while the diplodactyloid geckos are almost exclusively nocturnal, the pygopodids tend to vary between being nocturnal and diurnal, or, you know, at the start and end of the day. And it's postulated that the early switch to diurnality helped them to access food resources, as I mentioned before. An offshoot of the body elongation, so becoming longer, means that limbs sort of get in the way, and they also become less useful for moving through those soil cracks. And so we start to see not only the elongation of the body, but a reduction in limb length, moving towards limblessness, and a change in the mode of locomotion. So we start to see that lateral undulatory locomotion like you would see in a snake. So we've got some really early records of striped legless lizard. So from Kew in 1975, Mooney Ponds, and in 1875. And also in 1885 in Nunawading, which is interesting because we wouldn't go looking anywhere near Nunawading for legless lizards these days. That worked. Okay. The holotype for legless lizards was collected in 1882 by Fisher, and this was submitted to the State Museum of Zoology in Dresden, and it's believed to have been destroyed in the fires of the Dresden bombing. So that original holotype specimen no longer exists, but an eotype was collected from around Hamilton in 1904, and that resides at the Museum of Victoria. And just adding a bit further to the history, I'm sort of saying 1974 is, you know, history. In 1974, Kluge did a revision of the whole family, and that was quite significant. So when Fisher named the species, he called it Pseudodelma impar. It's also been known as Delma lineata, and we're now down to Delma impar. So the Delma, not sure where that came from, but obviously derived from the Pseudodelma. But I believe that the species name, so the impar, comes from Fisher's original classification, when he claimed that the species exhibited an odd number of mid-body scale rows. So when we're identifying reptiles, we often count mid-body scale rows. And the word impar is actually a medical term for unpaired anatomical parts. And so I think that what Fisher's getting at is these odd numbers of mid-body scale rows. I'm not sure, sort of guessing at that one. So just moving on with our timeline, in the mid-1980s, there were a few studies and reports done suggesting that the species was becoming rare around Melbourne. The museum records, I guess, sort of had a bit of a history of, you know, specimens coming in at some, you know, whatever rate it was. And by the 1980s, striped legless lizards were starting to appear less frequently in those museum specimens that were submitted. And the decline in numbers has also been associated with habitat loss, which is one of the big problems that we still see for this species. In 1991, it was listed on the ANZAC list of endangered vertebrate fauna, and also under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. And then in 1992, it was quickly listed at the national level under the Endangered Species Protection Act, which has since been subsumed by the EPBC Act. And a whole bunch of other states followed in their listing. So every state in Australia that striped legless lizards occur in actually lists this species as threatened. It only occurs, we'll get onto that where it occurs in a minute, but yeah, basically everywhere that it occurs, all the states it occurs in, it's listed as threatened. Very early on, Graham Coulson did a study that laid some of the groundwork for understanding some of the requirements of the species, and then this was followed up by a rather large report by Sue Haddon, who looked at a whole range of habitat parameters and variables. Just scrolling down. So when Sue Haddon did this report, she visited 125 known sites, historic sites for striped legless lizard, and she assessed whether those sites still existed as striped legless lizard habitat and seemed capable of supporting striped legless lizards. So from 125 sites, she concluded that only 45 of those sites still actually supported the species, either because they were no longer grassland habitat at all or had been so modified that they were unlikely to support the species. So since those first few studies, there's been quite a raft of follow-up studies and projects done at different levels of government, federal, state. Lots of unis and research institutes have been looking at this species for quite a while now, including myself. So this diagram sort of shows you where, the approximate distribution of striped legless lizards. So we've got a really broad expanse in Victoria where the species could occur. Doesn't say that that's exactly where they are, but this is sort of where you'd go looking, and moving across over into the South Australian border. They were recorded there. I think there's a couple of sites that still remain there. And then we've got a bunch of sites in the ACT and parts of New South Wales as well. So just zooming into Victoria, the top diagram, the blue squares sort of show you that striped legless lizards have been recorded within each of these cell grids. So that's the distribution that we know of across Victoria. If you come down and have a look at this map that has a lot of green on it, the green refers to native vegetation cover, and the white is areas that are no longer native vegetation. And if you sort of imagine superimposing this picture over this picture, you can sort of pick that the areas where striped legless lizards are occurring are the areas that have very little native vegetation left. So habitat loss is a really significant problem for this species. Just continuing on with distribution a little bit further. So Susie Maldonado at Melbourne Uni in 2009 did a genetic study of all the different populations, or a range of populations. And basically what she came up with was that there were 4 ESUs. So ESUs are evolutionarily significant units. So her work is suggesting that each of these little coloured shapes are genetically significantly different to each other. And so she showed that striped legless lizards as a species diverged from its closest relative somewhere around 19 million years ago. And then each of these groups have diverged from each other more recently. So the ACT and New South Wales ESU diverged about 3.1 million years ago, and she relates that to the incursion of rainforest in this intervening space for short periods of time. And so that actually, having rainforest appear in this space actually separated this group from the Victorian groups. And then the Victorian groups, she suggests, have been separated from each other by expansion and contraction of woodland over time. Striped legless lizards can occur in grassy woodland, but it would be very grassy and not much woodland. So we're sort of looking at, you know, grasslands that have a tree here and there in them. Once you start getting significant amounts of woody species, striped legless lizards start to drop out. And so we think that, well, Susie suggests that that's what's happened here, is that these have all become genetically different to each other just through that splitting up of the habitat as a result of woodland coming in and then decreasing. So we've got the South Australian Horsham group, the Southwest Victorian group, and the Eastern Victorian group, which is up around Alexander Yea sort of area, which I've probably got wrong. I always get Alexander and Alexandra. It's Alexandra, isn't it? I always get them mixed up. So this is, in a Melbourne context, this is what classic striped legless lizard habitat looks like. This is actually at my main field site that I work at. So we've got a nice thick sward of kangaroo grass, and this site did have plenty of striped legless lizards in it. So they're grassland specialists. Brett Howland did a little bit of work and published it in 2016. And so he was looking to understand what features of the habitat make really good striped legless lizard habitat. So we know that grasslands are key, but what sort of grasslands? And what he came out with was that structural complexity in the grassland is actually really important. So if you have a greater diversity in structure, you're more likely to have higher density, more robust populations that, you know, persist. And so the reason for that is that if you have greater structural complexity, you have a greater range of microhabitats, and that provides a greater range of opportunities to do things like forage efficiently, to, you know, get a greater range of thermoregulatory opportunities. You get a greater range of habitat to avoid predation and also to find prey. So having a grassland where it's just one big thick expanse of demeter, whilst that might be really great habitat for striped legless lizards, probably having a little bit of structural diversity makes it even better habitat. Haddon, just going back to that big report that Haddon found when she visited the 125 sites, she looked at a range of habitat features, and 70% of the sites that she assessed had a basalt type geology. So in Victoria, we're looking at things like the Victorian volcanic plain. In the ACT, the soils are a little bit different. But they tend to have a high clay content, and in Victoria that often means that the soils are cracking, and those cracking clays mean that there's opportunity for the lizards to occupy those soil cracks. In the ACT, it's thought that the lizards, rather than spending time in the soil cracks, actually just live in the tussocks. But it would be interesting to understand that a little bit further. So high clay content and cracking clays in Victoria, and this is you know, just a fortunate photo that we happened to snap of a lizard down a soil crack, just peeking out. And so what they tend to do is go down the soil crack, do a big U-turn, and then turn around and have their face poking up out of the soil crack. The cracks are probably really important, so they will overwinter in the soil in Victoria. and emerge up to the surface in September, early spring. And what I think is actually happening is, as the season progresses and the soil profile, so the soil profile in spring is actually very cold, and as it warms up, as we get towards the end of the year, well into summer, that soil profile actually warms up, and so the animals can spend more time down in that soil profile, thermoregulating, and there's probably quite a bit of invertebrate food. Those crickets are all running down those cracks and that sort of thing as well. One of the things that I often come across when people talk with me about legless lizards is that they're going to look, over in the rock pile. Legless lizards people seem to think belong in rocks. And Sue's work, you've got this little chart here. She assessed the rock cover across the 125 sites, and you can clearly see that a lot of the sites have very low rock cover. So yes, there are instances where legless lizards are in the high, areas with a high cover of rock, but probably they do actually like, a little bit of rock, not heaps of it. The majority of her sites were lightly grazed as well. So the light grazing probably feeds into that Brett Howland story about the structural complexity of the grassland. So you're getting that, especially if you have something like sheep where they're a little bit more selective, and they'll leave, the great big poa grasses and graze other grasses more shortly. So you do get that structure there. When I took this photo, these people are actually doing a striped legless lizard salvage. So this is, how striped legless lizards were once salvaged for translocation. You go in with a great big backhoe, dig up a clod of soil, and usually people are actually looking at what's happening rather than off into the distance. But the lizards would be picked up coming out of those clods of soil that were dug up. I don't think I realised when I took this photo that the great big sign across the road is for a development estate that's going in over grassland, and it says zoned, serviced and ready to go. And so this is the fate of striped legless lizards, particularly in Melbourne, and the fate of our grasslands. And this is why the Grassy Plains Network exists, is because we have this sort of scenario occurring. But not all development proposals get through, although there's probably some more recent updates on this 1994-95 article in the Canberra Times. So not a leg to stand on, but it's brought a city to a standstill. And so these are striped legless lizards without their legs to stand on that actually stopped the development of Gungahlin in the ACT. There's still a lot of development going on in the ACT now. I'm not up with where things are at, but at a point in time, these species made a sufficient amount of difference to stop or slow developments for significant amounts of time. A person called Josh Durrow and his supervisor, I think Julian Ash, did some work looking at predictors. So again, I guess building on the work that Sue Haddon had done, predictors of presence and abundance. And I guess the benefit of this work is that it feeds into understanding how we should be potentially managing our grasslands that have striped legless lizard populations on them. So we know that sites that have been cultivated, you lose your striped legless lizards, which is probably no surprise when you know that they occupy the soil profile for at least some period of the year. I'm assuming that cultivating basically just kills them. The other thing that cultivating may do is make that soil profile less habitable by way of making those clays less cracking clays, removing the spider burrows, that sort of thing. The soils may, I don't know, I guess maybe be more compacted when you've got cows grazing your grassland. So I'm assuming that big heavy cows trotting on striped legless lizards doesn't work for them either. And I'm assuming that there's a lot of soil compaction going on, which means that those soil cracks, spider burrows and whatever other cavities are all getting squashed down and actually removing habitat for the species. I guess that was the take-home message for me. There's, Josh did an amazing amount of work, including looking at expansion of striped legless lizard populations. But I'm sort of, cutting this down to a couple of dot points of don't cultivate your grasslands, don't fertilize them, and don't have heavy grazing animals on them either. We do have striped legless lizards in grasslands that have sheep grazing, but probably cattle grazing is probably really not very good. One of the questions I sometimes get asked is, well, how small is too small for striped legless lizards? And the answer is it would have to be pretty small, because we can get them in, I collected 86 animals from an area that was less than half a hectare. So we know that they can persist, and that half a hectare was basically there for 40 odd years. As it was a little bit bigger, a couple of hectares, but those animals persisted in that area for 40 odd years after the surrounding landscape had been modified. So this is some work that I did in 2014 and 2015 across a range of sites. So we've got the site, the area of available habitat at each of the sites, and then the estimated density of striped legless lizards per hectare at each of these sites. So I've got a small little, 6.3 hectare site, that's not very big, with a huge striped legless lizard density. We get down to sites that are 123 hectares of available habitat, and we're estimating that density is quite low. And we've got some zeros in here as well. And I guess what this says to me is, don't discount really small populations, because they may still be there, but probably the size is not so important. It's actually going back to that work around past habitat management. So has it been cultivated? Has it been grazed? Has it been regularly mown? Has it been fertilized? All those sorts of things are much more predictive about the population than the actual size of the available habitat. So past management is really important. Right. People want to know what striped legless lizards eat, and so there's a huge plethora of invertebrates out in our grasslands, but striped legless lizards are not only grassland specialists, they're dietary specialists as well. So Donna Noonan and Alex Cutt did a little bit of work on what they were eating. So they collected striped legless lizard scats, and they looked at them under the microscope to see what was in those scats. And what came out was that they're a little bit fussy, and they basically only eat 4 items of prey. So they eat our black field crickets, Tilia gryllus commodus. They also eat cockroaches. They eat caterpillars, particularly from the noctuid moth family, and they also eat they also eat spiders, and the spiders that they came out with were jumping spiders. This is a jumping spider. I don't know if it's one that would actually live in our grasslands, but just by way of demonstrating a jumping spider, and also wolf spiders in the grasslands. So there's very little, there might be an ant in a scat here or there, which, maybe just accidentally got eaten while they were, eating the caterpillar. I don't know. Sometimes a little bit of grasshopper, but, we're not seeing things like beetles, the true bugs. Our grasslands have a gazillion millipedes and flaters in them. They're not getting eaten. Ants, I've already mentioned the ants generally don't get are being eaten either. So quite specialist. In terms of reproduction, the animals, so the people at the zoo, so Chris Banks and a bunch of people at the zoo have worked out their reproductive cycle, and there's a paper published in 1999 around that. So the animals ovulate in early spring, and that's when they come out of brumation over winter. And the females deposit their eggs in early to mid-December. And at most, you get 2 eggs per female. And you might not get every female laying eggs every year. So we're not sure how frequently they reproduce. But it's 2 eggs per year at most. So you can infer from that the fecundity of these animals is actually really very low. So 2 animals per female per year, 2 eggs per female per year. And then we don't know what happens. Do all those eggs hatch into hatchlings, or we're not sure. So hatching occurs in mid-February. Striped legless lizards they're thinner than my little finger. They grow to about 30 centimeters, so the length of a ruler. When you get a hatchling, they look like a worm. They are tiny, and they're about 5 centimeters long when they hatch. So these tiny little animals. The females lay their eggs communally. So these are eggs in a soil crack. These photos were taken by Gary Peterson, and he kindly let me use them. And so you can see that there are numerous eggs in each of these cavities, and, you know, just driving home the point that we don't know what happens to these eggs. These eggs, we're not sure, they're no longer viable. We don't know if animals have actually hatched and they're just the egg cases, or whether those animals just didn't make it through. So a bit of a question about what happens after egg deposition. I've tried to understand sex ratios, and I guess my conclusion is that probably in most cases the sex ratio is, you know, 50-50, but we do see real skews, and that may be an artifact of sampling technique, or it may be peculiar to particular populations. But people always want to know, how do you tell a boy from a girl? And what we do is we lift up this limb flap. So this is a legless lizard, not a striped legless lizard, but it really nicely shows the limb flap. And then the feature that I'm looking for, which we call a cloacal spur. It is not a cloacal spur, but that's what we keep calling it. And you can see that it's this one scale that's a bit thicker than all the rest, has a bit of a waxy sort of look. Sometimes it looks a bit like a rice bubble to me. So when I'm out doing my striped legless lizard work, I am lifting up very carefully that tiny little limb flap to look through a magnifying glass to see whether there is this cloacal spur that indicates that this animal is a male. So a little bit fiddly. Wow, I thought that photo would come out a lot better than it did. Sorry that it's so blurry. But I guess, you know, there's been quite a bit of work done on the species, and we're still tying ourselves up in knots. Sorry, I just had to put that in there. Things like longevity, we don't really know how long they persist. It could be up to 10 years in the wild. I've never caught an animal beyond 8 years recapture. But presumably they're a few years old when I catch them the first time. So if you're catching them 8 years later, they probably are getting to 8 years in the wild. The zoo has a captive population, and I think that they still have animals in that population that they've had for more than 20 years. So in captivity can be very long-lived. We don't really have a good understanding of rates of mortality for either the juveniles or the adults. I've mentioned, you know, the the success of that egg deposition and what happens, do we get hatchlings from all of those? We don't really know. Population structures, we're still trying to understand. Population size, everyone wants to know how many lizards there are, and that's actually really difficult to estimate. How many lizards can any given site support? We don't really have a great understanding of that either. So I guess we've got lots of questions, and I just put that slide in so that I could show that photo, even though it is a bit blurry. So some of the work I've done in my PhD was around survey methods. So the traditional method for surveying for striped legless lizards is to sink a pitfall bucket in the ground. So this is about 10 litres in the ground, and we put a drift fence in, and the lizards wander along, come up to the drift fence, wander along the drift fence because they can't go under it, and they fall into the bucket, and then I come along and take them out. There are some really good things about pitfalling, but it's a hell of a job. So getting all those buckets into clay soil and then the drift fence as well is really challenging. So it's labour intensive. It's also really, you know, there's a lot of soil disturbance and habitat disturbance associated with that. And we would prefer to not be disturbing soil in our grasslands because that promotes weed growth. And then we also have animal welfare issues. So once the lizard falls into that bucket, it is actually trapped, and you need to get in quickly to get those animals out so that you don't have foxes or birds or ants coming along and picking them off. So there's an animal welfare issue. The good thing about pitfall traps is that you can do your surveys from spring all the way through to about this time of year in autumn, and you will get animals all through that period in your pitfall traps. The pitfall traps are also really good at picking up, they're okay at picking up hatchlings and adults. So you get a range of different types of animals through your population. But, you know, because of all these problems, we were looking for a better method, and one that resulted in more recaptures. So we get 10% recaptures or less than 10% recaptures using our pitfall traps. So I tried a few things. Some people up in the ACT were also trying roof tiles, so we're sort of doing this concurrently. And I was actually, you know, got all my tile grids out and diligently went and assessed them all and didn't find anything. So it was a bit disappointing, and I just sort of walked away. And then a few months later went, oh, I guess I should go and pack up those roof tiles. Got out there, and hey presto, there's all these legless lizards under the roof tiles. And so it's like, oh, okay, what's going on here? And so it turns out that roof tiles are really good for doing striped legless lizard surveys, but you need to know what you're doing so that you're maximising your opportunity of finding the animals. So the benefits of the roof tiles are that you're not digging those pitfall traps, so there's reduced labour, although carting hundreds of roof tiles out in a grassland is, you know, still pretty labour intensive. It does cause a lot less disturbance. So we're not causing that soil disturbance. If the tiles are left there for significant periods of time, the vegetation under them does die. So you are disturbing vegetation. And the soil, if you leave them there long enough, the tiles can actually sort of solidify to the cement to the soil, and that causes problems. So they cause less disturbance. The animals aren't actually trapped under these tiles, so they're free to come and go. So I have to be the person that knows when to go and find them at the right time. But one of the really good things is that we're getting up to 40%, maybe sometimes even higher levels of recapture of animals under those tiles. And so we're getting recaptures not only once, but sometimes I've had one animal that I've recaptured up to 10 times under the roof tiles. So that really helps us to understand those populations a little bit more. The other thing we get under the roof tiles is sloughs, so the shed skin. And the shed skin can help us to understand those populations as well. And I'll get onto that in a few minutes. Am I right to keep going, Adrian?
Yeah, of course, definitely.
Great. Okay, I think I'm almost done, but just a few more slides. So this is just, I've just pulled these out of my thesis. And I haven't thought about them too much in preparation for tonight. So with the roof tiles, one of the problems is that we get mostly adults. So we've got a breakdown of our size classes, and anything that's sort of from this 85mm mark up, I would call an adult, although I might change my mind about these ones at some point soon. So we get mostly adults. I've seen very, very few. So these two categories here, the 45 and the 55, we would call hatchlings, and the 65 and 75 I refer to as juveniles. Maybe the 65 is just the juveniles, really. But very few of these size animals occurring under roof tiles. We need to do our surveys in spring, so that actually limits the opportunity for doing research on these animals. So you need to get your tile surveys done in spring. By the time you get to Christmas, it's pretty much all over, whereas you will remember that with the pitfall traps, you can keep going up well into March. And we might possibly also get a sex bias under our roof tiles as well. So this is, I should have been flicking through these as I was talking about them. So this shows you, these are all the sampling regimes, tells you how many surveys we did at each of the time points. You know, pretty clearly getting striped legless lizards through September. October's a bit of a peak, and then it starts declining as you approach Christmas. I generally don't bother going out in January anymore. So really looking at September to December type surveys. And in relation to the sex bias, what we tend to have is a lot of males under our roof tiles very early on. And then this gets replaced by females. And what I think is going on is the males are out and about, they're looking for females to mate with. So they're really active early in the season. And then the females are gravid, and so these females in December are getting really close to needing to lay their eggs. They're really big and really fat, and you know, they just want to incubate those eggs so that they're producing the best quality offspring they can. And the tiles are really nice and warm, and so they're spending a lot more time under the tiles in these later warmer months, just so that they can get those eggs well cooked. And this is supported by work that Gary Peterson and Michael Scroggie and Ted Raw did, where they were looking at detection probabilities and very similar sorts of sorry, this slide doesn't actually show what I'm trying to say, but very similar sorts of patterns where you get a peak in your roof tile survey detections around that September, October, November period, and then it starts to decline. They also looked at time of day, and the time of day that you go and look under your roof tiles will vary across the year. But when you're looking at this peak period in the September, October, November period, you're probably maximising your survey potential after 10 o'clock, and sort of, you know, it starts to decline once you get past mid-afternoon. They did some work on the temperature of the soil, and Kate Saliba, I haven't included, it would have been a good addition to this talk, Kate Saliba from Melbourne Uni also did some work on when to go and look for striped legless lizards. And the temperature of the soil and the air temperature are also important. And what she actually found was that it's the difference between the temperature of the soil and the temperature of the air that is actually more important than just the temperature of the soil or the temperature of the air. And so if you think about legless lizards actually moving in under roof tiles, they don't live under them. They use them for thermoregulation. So they use them to regulate their body temperature to warm up. And when you're coming out of winter into spring, you get a really big differential between the soil temperature, which is quite cold and it stays cold for quite a while, and the temperature of the roof tile that gets that spring sunshine that warms it up quite quickly. And so being under the tile is a really nice place to be. And as you get closer to Christmas, the soil profile has warmed up, but the roof tiles are like, they're getting over 60 degrees Celsius, and that's you put your hand on that and it hurts. So that's not a good place for a legless lizard to be. So the temperature difference between the ambient air temperature and the soil temperature seems to be a bit of a cue as to what to go and look for. One of the other things I did with my PhD was try to work out how can you tell one individual from another. And what we started off with was pyrobranding lizards. So they've got, if you flip them over onto their back, they've got these paired ventral scales, and you can come up with a numbering system. So the animals get branded, and it's actually really horrible. They do survive it, but it's, you know, less than ideal. And so I did a whole lot of taking photos of striped legless lizard heads, and it turns out that the lizard head scales are a bit like a thumbprint. And so we have this prefrontal scale, this weird triangular sort of shaped frontal. These really big scales are called the parietals, and then behind the parietals we have a range of nuchals. I look at all these scales when I'm trying to tell the difference from one lizard to another, but the nuchal scales are the ones that I most commonly refer to. And so I'm very confident with using this method. I think it's very accurate. It's obviously a lot more humane. I've shown that it's durable by photographing hatchlings or very young animals and then photographing them years later, and they still have that same head scale arrangement. And I guess it's a pretty simple technique as well. So just to demonstrate some differences. So with the nuchals, you can see this animal's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scales immediately behind the parietals, and then it's got a few nuchals behind that, and this one's actually quite long. So when I'm doing my assessment, I'm looking at peculiar features, and I would call this lizard sort of a bit of a baseline type arrangement of scales. So here are some examples of how the nuchals can change. So remember, the parietals are these really big ones, and then this one is the one that we were just looking at, I think. And then we've got another lizard where we've got all the nuchals have sort of merged, and this one only has 2 big broad nuchals behind it. So those lizards are obviously different to each other. And, you know, there are lots more examples. So I could have given examples of, you know, changes in the parietals and the other scales as well, but the nuchals are the ones that I focus on. The really cool thing about the head scales is that when the lizards go under the roof tiles and they leave you a little present of a sloughed skin, if it's got the head scales, you can actually identify your animal without actually catching it. So this is an animal that I'd caught at some point in time, and the thing that I'm looking at here is this really odd arrangement where we've got this small nuchal between the parietals, and then these nuchals behind sort of merging into each other. And if we go up here, it's a different angle, but this is these are the parietals. This is the small nuchal sort of between the parietals and those merged nuchals behind that. And you know, you might not, you know, necessarily think that's the same animal, but when you pick up this these head scales on this slough that's under the tile that you caught this animal under, or a nearby tile, you're sort of reasonably confident that you're picking up the same animal. So there's lots of other things that have happened that I haven't included in this presentation, partly because I'm a bit time poor for, it seems like forever, and also because some of them are a little bit controversial. But just a few thank yous. Helen is a good friend of mine, and she did the sound recording of that striped legless lizard that we didn't get to hear. Martin edited that recording so that it cut out a whole lot of the background noise. The picture of this lizard that's been on the side of every slide was taken by Deb Reynolds. I mentioned Steve and the legless lizard that was eating the gecko, so Steve took that. Matt Clancy came out and did a little bit of field work with me, and he provided that really great photo of the striped legless lizard licking its face with its tongue, and Gary Peterson provided the photos of the nests with the eggs in them. And just to emphasize how cryptic this species is, there's a striped legless lizard in this photo. Now that I've said it, you can probably see it, but for those who haven't picked it yet, there it is hiding away in there. So they're incredibly well camouflaged and very difficult to see, very difficult to study. That's it. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you, Megan. That was fabulous. It's great to hear someone with such an enthusiasm for their subject. It's quite infectious. We've got some time for some questions, so I'll just start off with one from the chat. Then people can just sort of unmute themselves and say what they want. Someone's wanting to know where which zoo in Melbourne has the striped legless lizards, and can they be viewed in captivity?
The Melbourne Zoo in Parkville, and last time I was there, yes, they could. I haven't been for a while, so I can't say that they're definitely still there, but Melbourne Zoo.
Okay, that's fantastic. Does anyone else have some questions? No,
great. I have a question. Thanks. Great talk, Megan. Can you give me some idea about handling them? I come across them from time to time, but they leap all over the place, and I don't want to damage them when I pick them up, or should I pick them up? Just how do you handle them? Should we handle them at all?
Yeah, I guess, the politic answer is probably try to not be handling them. So I'm not quite sure who I'm talking to, but
Simon Jolly.
Oh, Simon, hello. Yes, preferable to not handle them and to not move them. So striped legless lizards have very small home ranges. So we're talking, probably 15, 20 metre sort of ranges. They can travel a lot further, but all the animals that I've recaptured are within sort of about 15 metres of where I originally captured them. So we certainly don't want to be moving them around, preferably not handling them. And you really need to be mindful that they do drop their tail. 1/3 of the animal is body, 2/3 tail. If you pick them up by the tail, that tail will break. And the tail is actually really, really important for these animals because it stores, there's a store of fat in that tail. And so that store of fat is really important for those animals getting through winter. That's what provides them with the energy. The tail is also really important for moving. So once we break the tail, the animals actually move less efficiently through the grassland. So look after their tails.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hello, Adrian.
Yes, Ray Radford.
Yeah, I did send a message to Megan. She probably hasn't seen it, but just the susceptibility of striped legless lizards to cultivation suggests that there would be a problem for the type of revegetation process where the topsoil is removed and grassland seeds are planted. Have you got a comment on that?
Yeah, I do. You know, so I work out at Iramoo Grassland Reserve. So we've, you know, got a few areas of Chilean, well, we're getting rid of them, but areas of Chilean needlegrass and that sort of thing. It would be very tempting to just, you know, dig the lot up and start again. But it is striped legless lizard habitat. So that process of scalping and scraping the soil, you just, you know, whilst it's, you know, shown to be a good, you know, method for rebuilding grassland or recreating grassland, if you've got legless lizards in there, they're not going to survive that. So you need to have other methods. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There's some other questions in the chat, Megan. Deb's on her own today with an interesting name, is asks, how does heavy rain impact during winter and summer? Fill those cracks up, or what's the impact there?
Oh, well, yeah, I don't know, and I would love to know what happens there. So, you know, we work at these grasslands that get incredibly waterlogged, and sometimes the water table looks like it's actually higher than the soil profile. I just don't know. It's a mystery that I've wondered about, and I just don't know.
Okay. On the habit in surviving in cracks, I suppose, Megan Fraser asks what happens with ecological burns.
I wouldn't like the presence of striped legless lizards to stop ecological burns, because they are necessary in some capacity, but we do need to be careful. So the recommendation is to try to hold off your burns until those soil cracks are present. So we're sort of talking, you know, well into spring, where those soil cracks are opening up and the lizards can actually get down into the soil. The fire obviously will kill legless lizards. I've seen legless lizards killed by fire. Sorry, I just had a complete mental blank then.
So the fire is probably important too.
The fire is important, that's right. You know, they've obviously evolved in a landscape that has a history of fire going through it. One of the things I'm interested in is the way we do the fire. So sometimes we have these very hot fires that are, when we have sometimes had controlled burns out at our grassland, the fire is lit on multiple sides, and so it sort of all whooshes into the center. It's very hot, it's very fast. The animals don't get many cues, and even that process of burning into the wind concerns me, because that means that the smoke signals are not actually being sent to the animals. So if they actually pick up those smoke signals, I guess there's a possibility that they might go, oh, there's a fire, let's, you know, take some action to try and avoid that by getting down a soil crack. So the way you do the fire could be quite important. And the other thing that really concerns me is the frequency of fire. So, you know, just coming back to the grasslands that I'm familiar with, sometimes I think our fire frequency is much too great. And I know we've got competing interests in terms of floristics, and, you know, I'm passionate about grasslands, so I want, you know, I'm into the flora, not just striped legless lizards, but it does become a bit of a problem when we've got these, you know, small isolated sites that we're trying to manage for competing interests. You know, we need to look after the legless lizards, and we need to manage the biomass as well. So I think that there's actually room for a bit more work in that space to try to come up with a biomass management process that maybe is not so fire dependent or so frequently fire dependent.
Some kangaroos, perhaps.
Yeah.
Susie asks, says she thought she saw one recently near Malcolm Creek in Craigieburn. Would you say that's a likely sighting?
Not sure. The north of those northern suburbs of Melbourne, people have been looking for legless lizards for quite a long time without success. So I guess it's a possibility, but there's not really recent records out that way. So that might be a really significant, sighting, and maybe worth further investigation.
And Nunawading too. And,
where are the grasslands in Nunawading?
yes, indeed. So I'd like to ask, like with the you said that in grassy woodland we tend to lose them. They're not present. What is it about grassy woodland? Is it the lack of complexity of the understory, or is it predation stuff going on, or what?
I don't know. Yeah, what is it about those woodlands?
Hmm.
So interestingly, Josh Durrow, who I mentioned in the talk, who was looking at those predictors of presence and abundance, some of the work that they did looked at grasslands that were once woodland and the trees had been cut down for firewood or whatever reason. And he was documenting the lizards moving into those created grasslands have been created because the trees have been removed. So it's something about the trees.
Thermoregulation, maybe. Claire asks, will individuals use roof tiles with little or no vegetation cover underneath? Just wondering for long-term monitoring sites if it's better to regularly move the tiles through a site.
Yes. So I pack up my roof tiles at the end of each survey season. I don't leave them set up in their grids, because you do lose the vegetation underneath. You get tile scars. We don't know what's going on under those tiles when we're not there monitoring. So there might be a few untoward things happening under those tiles that we prefer didn't happen. Eventually those tiles will, as I mentioned, cement to the soil, and so they're actually not providing any survey opportunity at all. And they become really difficult to find, and they get broken and all sorts of things. Pack your tiles up at the end of your survey and put them out again next year.
Okay. And last one maybe, Shez asks, or says that there appears to be still a lot to learn about the species. What future plans are there for research and so on?
Golly. Well, I'm going to be so non-creative in my response to this. Look, I've been doing a little bit of work around translocation, which is problematic in Victoria. Whilst I wouldn't, just willy-nilly advocate for translocation of animals, I think that it is useful to understand how to translocate these animals. And this might not be anything to do with development. This might be around population management and that type of thing. So I've done a little bit of work there. I think the vegetation management is really a key one. So understanding, a lot more about how to use fire to manage the vegetation or other biomass management techniques, I think is a really key area to get a good understanding of. And I was going to say something else and I can't think what it was now. Okay.